Good evening, everyone. My name is Janie Herman, and I am the manager of adult programming here at the Princeton Public Library. Our program tonight has been several months in the making. A lot of logistics and planning has gone into this, and none of it would have been possible without the support and hard work of our amazing collaborators at the New Jersey Council for the Humanities and the National Humanities Center. We have a very full program ahead, but first just a few quick housekeeping notes. This room is equipped with a hearing loop, and that will pair with T-coil technology. If you need hearing assistance, we do have some T-coil enabled headphones. You can just raise your hand and we will run you a pair over. Also, we kindly ask that you silence electronic devices during the talk and that you hold your questions, as there will be a chance for audience and question and answer at the end of the presentation. So it's now my honor to invite Edward Felton, the Robert E. Kahn Professor of Computer Science and Public Affairs at Princeton University, who is also a member of the Princeton Public Library's Board of Trustees, to the podium to say a few words.
Thanks. On behalf of the trustees of the library and of the Princeton Public Library, I'd like to welcome everyone here to our wonderful space and for a very exciting and interesting event, which I can't wait to see and hear. I spent many years of my career as a scholar and as a public official investigating and thinking about the impact of AI on our lives and on how we as a society should respond to that. The history of the development of AI has involved one after another of surprising advances, each of which has challenged our understanding of what it is that we as humans are uniquely capable of and how it is that we interact with technology. We have a wonderful panel here today to address these questions, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say. I'd like to now introduce and invite to the microphone Karen Berkowitz, the Executive Director of the New Jersey Council for the Humanities.
This is the inevitable part where I lower the microphone. Thank you, Ed. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to everybody in the audience. As Ed said, I am the Executive Director of the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. We are a 501c3 nonprofit and the statewide partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And it was our delight to partner with this incredible jewel of an institution, Princeton Public Library, and with the National Humanities Center, which is located in the Research Triangle in North Carolina. We had a really amazing collaboration that generated tonight's event, so I just want to take a second to thank the people whose intellectual labor made all of this possible, and sometimes physical labor too, as we got closer to the event this evening. Valerie Popp from NJCH, if each of you could just stand up for a second. Valerie Popp from NJCH. Janie Herman and Cliff Robinson from Princeton Public Library. And unfortunately, Jackie Kellish from the National Humanities Center can't be with us because she's ill, but she was part of our little group that sort of valiantly fought to get this event to come together with incredibly diverse, engaging speakers for you. So really, they put in incredible work. We really want to thank them, and then thank everybody on the staff of Princeton Public Library who's helped to make this possible. You all do so many events here at the library that there was a quick turnover happening even late this afternoon with this room, and that's only possible when you have an incredible team of people working together to make something happen. So big thanks to the staff of Princeton Public Library, big thanks also to the staff of the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. Everybody pitched in to try to make this event come off, and we are delighted to have all of you join us for it. My primary responsibility tonight, though, is to introduce our moderator, our fearless leader for the next hour and a half, Rishi Jaitley. Rooted in place and guided by service, Rishi Jaitley is a leading advocate of the humanities with uncommon entrepreneurial, international, and executive experience at the intersection of technology, media, and civics. Presently, Jaitley is a professor of practice and distinguished humanities fellow at Virginia Tech. He also founded and leads Virginia Tech's Institute for Leadership in Technology, an effort to offer a new executive humanities certificate to rising leaders in the technology landscape. Yay, humanities. Earlier in his career, he was the founding CEO of the venture firm TimesBridge, Twitter's vice president for Asia Pacific and Middle East, the founder of Michigan Core, the Detroit director of the Knight Foundation, the public policy lead for College Summit and Google in South Asia, and a speechwriter to Google's chairman and CEO. And after hearing all of those things, you expect a person who's in his 80s, because that's an awful lot of accomplishments, Rishi, almost embarrassingly many. Jaitley earned an AB in history from Princeton University, where he later served as a trustee and presently serves on the boards of Virginia Humanities and the National Humanities Center. I can't think of anyone better to lead a conversation like this. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him.
All right, good to be with you all. Thank you, Karin. Wonderful to be back in Princeton with friends new and old, and to be with you all this evening. Thank you also to Valerie, to Jackie from the National Humanities Center, and everyone else for having me. So before I introduce our panelists and begin tonight's conversation, I thought I would open with some context about some of the themes we're going to touch on this evening, and offer, even though I'm moderator, a sneak peek at my take on how I think about, as a humanities entrepreneur, which is how I see myself these days, how I think about our shared opportunity, and I'd argue our responsibility, our shared responsibility and obligation and duty on this question of creativity in the age of ChatGPT. Of course, and as we'll discuss later, creativity itself predates this age. We'll talk a little bit later about human creativity, what we mean by creativity, and breakthrough advances in generative AI also predate ChatGPT. ChatGPT doesn't necessarily, some would say, mark the beginning of the generative AI era. The most recent roots of generative AI and neural networks, as many of you know, many in this room are likely more expert at machine learning and neural networks than I am, but can be traced back to, on the left there, a 2017 Google research paper written by a group of Googlers, published publicly, which chronicled the breakthrough role of transformers. But machine learning has been around before then and been used to solve predictive human problems. Indeed, unlike other sciences where neat formulas can sometimes be determinant, in these human sciences, it's becoming increasingly clear that data, particularly unreasonably effective data, to borrow a phrase from another influential paper by Googlers, is determinant. Data becomes determinant. And so here's Google, of course, predicting, using mountains of data to correctly predict and detect my intent on a Google search the other day about a lake near my home in Virginia. But in fact, this landscape is so dynamic that just last week, the week of September 25th, 2023, might have been the most active week in Gen AI history. OpenAI in the middle announced an ability just last week for ChatGPT to receive natural language input via voice in images. So you're not just texting with an AI assistant for problem solving or output, creative output. You can in fact send an image to the platform, send videos to the platform for the paid version. That was just last week. Rumors circulated last week that OpenAI might be building a ChatGPT iPhone with Johnny Ive, Apple's former chief design officer. Meta, on the left, the company that owns Facebook and Instagram, announced last week a partnership with Ray-Ban, the maker of sunglasses, a product that will allow you to walk around with an AI assistant that can hear you and see what you're seeing. And the CIA last week was reported by Bloomberg to be building its own ChatGPT-like tool to further its ability to detect signal from noise, insight from public intelligence data. That's just last week. So we are very much in this conversation. I don't knows are okay today because there's so much changing each day, actually. And so here's kind of a current view of how at least we might imagine the state of corporate affairs, at least, on this topic. Amazon last week announced an investment in Anthropic, another Gen AI startup. And so while we call this event ChatGPT, I guess what I'm getting at here is that some might argue that though GPT and OpenAI undoubtedly captured the zeitgeist around Gen AI beginning late last year, many are reminding us that this ecosystem is actually already multipolar. And Gen AI functionality is poised to be pervasive across our digital lives, embedded in tools we use today, not just tools we need to run to. So what does this mean for creativity? Well, that's what we're going to explore tonight. One take is that we're on the forefront, and in fact, already in the midst of, we've got artists here that use AI to create art. Yet another moment when the internet further democratizes and augments creativity worldwide. And I lived in emerging markets for companies, Silicon Valley companies in the 2000s and 2010s, and I bore witness to the awe-inspiring creative potential that all things digital can usher in. Importantly, in the global north, where we are, but also in the global south. It felt like a good thing. Just a few years ago, even in the midst of COVID, we were, or at least the hype cycle, was celebrating the arrival of a passion economy. If you can find 1,000 people worldwide that might just keep up with your creative pursuits, so the saying goes, you can make a life. And GPT, perhaps, is just a furthering of that creative era ushered in a couple of decades ago with the onset of the consumer internet. Another take is that we might be on the verge of an era in which creativity itself is under siege by generative AI. And we, meaning-making machines, also known as humans, will need to dig elsewhere for said meaning. Here's a perspective. Like with prior digital revolutions, but maybe even more so this time, we're going to need to be mindful of the risk of a coming creative divide. An era in which not just knowledge, we used to talk about, you have the libraries of ancient Egypt and Europe in your pocket. In the palms of your hands, you're going to have the ability, profound creative potential in the palms of your hands. But the ability to harness this creative potential may only reside with the full stack humans of the future, to quote author Scott Hartley. In other words, those equipped, this is in the future, with distinguished human skills and human sensibilities emanating from the foundational stack that is the liberal arts. Maybe the people who are able to apply their timeless humanity to timely technology and creative opportunities of the day, maybe it's those people that'll prove to be the winners. And what do we do about that? In the tech landscape, we speak of the stack and the various layers at which software programmers engage. The infrastructure layer, the front-end layer. The stack, though, might also be a helpful way to imagine the superpowers, creative and otherwise, of the future. Speaking of the superpower of the future, I myself am proud to be building at Virginia Tech, which, like Princeton University, is an institution undergirded by values of service, the nation's first executive degree in the humanities. So think about this. We have executives just 2 weeks ago from Microsoft, Amazon, Boeing, residents and elsewhere, residents of 4 countries who've decided to spend a year immersing themselves in the serious study of global philosophy, religion, history, creative writing, literature, and more. To me, that's a mind-multiplying thought. And it reveals something powerful about our moment. Because they know that sustaining their own creativity and their leadership might just flow from the humanities. So that's just one example of how we might all together take creativity to market in new ways. It's just one example. And I hope you leave this conversation feeling empowered to see yourself as agents of taking creativity to market in new ways. All right, that's enough for me. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. They're going to come up here and do a version of this as well. Minli Chan is an essayist and technologist based in Oakland, California. Her essays have appeared in the Yale Review, New England Review, The Point Magazine, and BuzzFeed, and she's currently at work on a collection of essays on art, algorithms, language, and precarity in contemporary technological life. A former Googler, like me, she is a recipient of the 2018 BuzzFeed Emerging Writers Fellowship and a finalist for Farrar, Straus Giroux's inaugural Writers Fellowship. As a technologist in Silicon Valley, she has worked on speculative technologies from self-driving cars to tools for citizen cartography. Minli was born and raised in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Welcome, Minli.
Hi, everyone. A huge thank you once again to the tremendous team behind this event. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Rishi, Edward, and Helena, and with all of you this evening. So I come to this topic as someone situated between the worlds of big tech and the literary arts, as a technologist who worked for Google and Alphabet for over a decade, and as an essayist who engages critically with contemporary technological life and its complications. So for my presentation today, I'd like to offer a mini essay or a brief meditation on generative AI from the lens of art. And as a quick note, a longer version of this essay was published earlier this year in the Point magazine. I opened the computer some months ago in search of a metaphor for new parenthood. I was looking for an image, something from the internet's infinitude to help me parse the shock of new life. I recalled seeing in the weeks before our newborn arrived, images that an artificial intelligence had generated from descriptions fed by its users. The images were strange as a result of the implausible prompts that spawned them. A Taco Bell in the style of Frank Lloyd Wright, or Antoni Gaudí. Electron microscope photography of a tardigrade wearing a virtual reality headset. This strangeness spoke to something of the state I was in. I found myself examining the high-resolution photographs that the AI had generated in response to this prompt offered by a well-known technologist. 2 slugs in wedding attire getting married, stunning editorial photo for Bridal magazine, shot at golden hour. In the first photo, the slugs were draped in soft silk cloaks fastened with the corsages. In the second, the slugs faced each other, even as they were faceless, their antennae gently touching. In the third, both slugs, one wearing an intricate hat made of honeycomb and the other a headpiece constructed from a stack of fresh cotton balls, appeared to cast a gaze far off in parallel directions, as if moved by some invisible bond of mutual understanding. It was all a little much. But there was, in fact, so much in these generated images. The performance and the tropes of bridal magazine photography, the mores of nuptial fashion, scaled down and attentively adapted to a slug body and the affordances of its habitat. A genre shot through with heteronormativity, now made a little queer. It is tempting to ascribe real imagination, whatever we take it to mean, to the AI models that are now capable of conjuring astonishingly cogent images from bonkers descriptions, that can craft stories with pathos and converse with ostensible feeling with humans about parenthood and mortality. These AI models that are, in the first place, trained on the collective knowledge and idiocy of the internet. But perhaps because I'm too much a skeptic and an engineer, I'm more inclined to the argument that artificial intelligence is part of a lineage of cultural technologies that have allowed us to encode and access the intelligence of other humans across generations, just as internet search and libraries and print and the writing system have, just as language itself has. And so I was curious about what this collective human intelligence, as distilled by an AI system, might show me in those early weeks, when my partner and I, sleepless and suspended between queer parenthood's tender terrors and its utter banality, hardly knew what to think or how to meet the world, and time seemed to compress and dilate according to an unfamiliar logic. I remembered once hearing the artist Julie Meritu speak of painting as a means for addressing ideas and experiences that we do not yet have proper language for. I thought of the works of Meritu's that I had seen in San Francisco, canvases 27 feet high and 32 feet wide, with underlayers composed of photographs of expansionist landscape paintings of the American West and newspaper photos of protests following police shootings of Black men, all scaled up to such proportions that their references were no longer recognizable. On top of these layers, Meritu painted, mark-making and erasing across the canvas's monumental expanse, using a hydraulic lift to move between its different sections, and then back to the ground, where she could apprehend the abstract, densely layered work in its entirety. And so, into the text box, I typed, "Queer time and motherhood in the style of Julie Meritu," and waited. The resulting images at first thrilled me. I could see the gestural nod at Meritu's mark-making, black lines tangling and threading through the generated images, splashes of vibrant color drawn from Meritu's early architectonic work. But where the problem began for me was the AI system's tilt toward literal representation, as if to signal that it understood the prompt, faithfully rendering aspects of two female-presenting bodies and a child. Ultimately absent from the AI's attempts, despite all the descriptions and reviews and essays of Meritu's work in her process that it had ingested from the internet, were the underlayers, the echoes of colonialism and capitalism that haunt contemporary life. I looked these images over again, carefully, and felt nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Min Lee. Up next, we have Edward Jones-Imhotep. He's director of the Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. A historian of the social and cultural life of machines, he writes about topics ranging from the history of music studies and of artificial life to space technologies and the technological geographies of islands. His research is particularly interested in histories of technological failure, breakdowns, malfunctions, accidents, and what they reveal about the place of machines and the stake of machine failures in culture, politics, and economics of modern societies. His first book, The Unreliable Nation, Hostile Nature and Technological Failure in the Cold War, won the Sidney Edelstein Prize for the best scholarly book in the field of history of technology. He's currently finishing a second book, Reliable Humans, Trustworthy Machines, examining how people from the late 18th to the mid-20th centuries understood machine failures as a problem of the self, a problem of the kinds of people that failing machines created or threatened or presupposed. Welcome, Edward.
Thanks so much for that very, very kind introduction, and thank you again, everybody, for the logistics behind this amazing event. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to be in conversation with all of you as well. As a historian of technological failure, I'm always really gratified to see that nothing has gone wrong with the PowerPoint presentations or the microphones that you just had. I'm never looking for additional material to write about, so that's really wonderful. What I wanted to do actually in the short talk that I wanted to give you is to pick up actually on something that Ed mentioned in his introductory remarks, and to expand it a little bit. Namely, this question about how it is that ChatGPT, from its very beginnings, has been implicated in these questions about the uniquely human and what defines or distinguishes, for instance, the machine from the human. And what I thought it might be interesting to do then is to place this question of creativity within a slightly longer history of automated technologies, of which ChatGPT is just one. And one place to do that is to go back to a period that historians of science and technology often end up locating as a critical moment, basically, in the development of certain kinds of automated technologies that problematize exactly this question of the line between the machine and the human. This is a depiction from an 18th century scene. The person who you see there kind of centered, but on the left, is a man named Pierre-Jacques Droz, who's a very famous automaton maker, an artisan, basically, who creates automatic machines, and most famously creates them in the form of humans, in the form of androids. And he's presenting 3 of these androids that you see there to the court of Louis XV in France. And the point about this moment that ends up capturing the imaginations of historians of science and technology is that this is the moment, supposedly, that these androids become incredibly lifelike. So lifelike, in fact, that they start to trouble this boundary between the human and the machinic. And they end up launching a series of debates and questions and inquiries into what it is that makes, for instance, the human and distinguishes them from the machine around a series of characteristics, often having to do with agency, for instance, or with sentiment, or with intelligence, or with rationality. And most recently, obviously, with questions of creativity. And so the whole discussion today about ChatGPT and creativity is part of, in fact, a very, very long history, in fact, of both automated technologies and their ability to act as sites where people ask these kinds of questions about what distinguishes the human from the truly, the machine from the truly human. But the other thing that I wanted to point out from this illustration is really 2 things. One is that all of those characteristics that I mentioned about the human, agency, intelligence, etc., they always take often a specific form of the human. And so we have to ask ourselves a little bit also, maybe throughout today, maybe in the future, what is the specific form of creativity? That is, whose creativity are we talking about also when we talk about this challenge or this resonance between creativity, for instance, and ChatGPT? The other thing, though, that this points to is what I call the famous disappearing trick of automated technologies. All automated technologies, whether they're 18th century androids or 21st century self-driving cars, involve a specific kind of trick, and namely a disappearing act. And essentially what they do is that they take enormous amounts of labor that often end up going into creating these technologies, foregrounding them, and they put it just out of view to create the illusion of automation. That is that something like these androids, for instance, that you see here, are never going to build themselves, they're never going to machine their own gears, they're never going to make their own clothes, they're never going to wind themselves up. All of the labor and the resources that go into that creation get pushed slightly just off stage once they end up going into action to create the illusion then of automation. And that's true of any automated technology. And that leads me to the second slide that I wanted to show you. This is something called the anatomy of an AI system. It's actually an artwork that's deposited, in fact, in the digital collections at the Met. It's created by Kate Crawford and Vladimir Yoder. And it represents the human labor, data, global resources, extractive industries that go into the creation and the performance, the actual execution of the Amazon Echo, one of the homes of the Alexa personal voice assistant. The point about this representation that I think is so fascinating is that this slide doesn't do it justice. It's meant actually to be reproduced at a scale of 8.5 feet by 10 feet. The reason why is because if you reproduce it any smaller than that, you lose all of the detail. And that's the point. The point is precisely to end up emphasizing the gargantuan systems that actually lie behind what we see as, for instance, a simple request to tell us the time or to play our favorite music or whatever it is. So these kinds of backstage systems can end up seeming quite oppressive. One of the things that I want, though, to end up bringing out maybe in the discussion that we have today is that I think that part of the anxiety sometimes that ends up surrounding creativity and ChatGPT on the part of artists is where and why they occupy this backstage. How it is that they end up fitting basically into this backstage that is often hidden basically from the features of automation that we're actually familiar with And I'm happy to talk much more about that in the Q&A. But the last point that I wanted to make about this illustration is just that it ends up lending itself in its size and in its kind of scale to this notion that we in the history of science and technology like to call technological determinism. The idea, in fact, that the evolution of these systems is inevitable. That is, that they're so gargantuan and possess so much momentum, what can we possibly end up doing to stop them? And this has led throughout the history of automation to very, very dire predictions of calamity, for instance, and collapse and so on, for hundreds of years. One thing that I want to leave you with then is moments of hope, in fact, by illustrating in some ways how it is that those predictions of calamity have in fact sometimes turned out to be wrong. And this isn't to diminish the very real concerns that people have about these systems or the very real ways in which automation has actually disrupted lives and displaced work. But just to give you an idea that sometimes the hype that ends up surrounding the arrival of automated technologies isn't always realized. The last two images that you see are, let's start with the one in the top left. Many of you will recognize this perhaps as Glenn Gould, the famous pianist, at work in the recording studio. So Gould is well known for many things, mostly for his piano playing, but the reason why this image in particular is really interesting for our purposes is because in 1964, Gould actually retires from concert performance forever at the age of 32. He never gives a live performance again. And in fact, he declares that by the end of the 20th century, the concert hall will be dead. And it will be dead because of recording technologies. He believes that the recording technologies, new malleable tape, reel-to-reel machines, etc., phonographs will end up basically destroying the concert-going audience and will end up leading to the collapse, basically, of the concert hall. So he was wrong. I don't need to tell you that. But the point is that Gould had this vision, basically, of technology and the history of technology that is incredibly common, but that is in many ways very much mistaken. And again, I hope that we'll talk about this during the question and answer. This idea of a kind of monarchical succession of technologies, that when one new technology comes in, it wipes off the face of the earth older technologies. That's, historically speaking, that's not actually the way that technological developments and change actually happen. There's a remarkable amount of coexistence that happens actually between different technologies of different historical regimes that we might think of. But the more interesting thing in this case also about Gould is that he could have never predicted, and he didn't predict, what you see in the bottom right, which is that in the late 1970s, that Joseph Sadler, also known sometimes as Grandmaster Flash, would actually do something sacrilegious, which was to lay his hands on the surface of a vinyl record, in fact, using two identical vinyl records and a mixing board to create essentially an infinite loop of the break section of a record, the break line where basically the melodies drop out and all you get is basically the break beats. And would lay the foundations, in fact, of not only breakdancing, but also of hip hop. And some of the sampling culture, in fact, that resonates with some of the concerns around ChatGPT, but without which it's very hard to imagine what early 20th century music would, in fact, popularly would end up looking like. And so there's this idea that just like automation, and just like the histories of automation, creativity is simply a category that will not stay still. And it is a category through the lens of technology for which it's impossible to end up predicting the kinds of uses to which people will end up putting these technologies. So I don't want to say much more about that, but I hope that it offers at least some interesting perspectives, basically, from the history of technology itself, and specifically from the history of automation, to at least start a discussion about the kinds of concerns that are central, I think, to this question about creativity in the age of ChatGPT. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Edward. And now our final panelist and speaker, Helena Sarin, visual artist, software engineer and maker, an engineering artist, if you will. Helena has always worked with cutting-edge technologies. Art making ran as a parallel track for her, and all her art was analog, until she discovered generative adversarial networks. Since then, generative models have become her primary medium, creating at the intersection of technology and art elevated, actually, her artistic voice. Helena is a frequent speaker at ML/AI conferences. In the last few years, she's delivered talks at MIT, the Library of Congress, Capital One, Adobe Research, CMU, TEDx Constance. Her artwork has been widely exhibited and featured in a wide range of national and international publications. She's published 4 artist books, and her recent forays are into animations and generative pottery. Welcome, Helena. Well, that was 3 fascinating little TED Talk, lightning talks. I really appreciated that. We're going to get to your all's questions in about 15-ish minutes, so start thinking about the questions you want to ask. I'm going to start with just sort of, I had a lot come to me as I was listening. I'm going to start with Edward, just to, as our historian here, I liked a lot of what you said about sort of historicizing technology. Can you help us historicize creativity specifically? You noted that creativity will not stay still, but if you could do your best to sort of define, notwithstanding, as you indicated, creativity, we tend to mean something when we use these words. How would you, table stakes, define creativity and offer us a history of human creativity, to what extent it's been resilient? How can you say and know it will stay still, so to speak?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question. It's a wonderful question. I'm going to answer it in a little bit of a roundabout way, briefly, but roundabout. To say this, that I think one of the most interesting things about the long history of creativity, so as a word, creativity actually in English at least, goes back to something like the 17th century. But for our purposes, its most interesting moment actually probably occurs during the Cold War, in fact. Because it turns out that creativity becomes an incredibly important political category or tool from the 1950s and 1960s. And partly because it gets paired with a series of other characteristics, open-mindedness, tolerance, rationality, that are seen to define the ideal citizen in liberal democracies. And so they're seen as a very, very important bulwark in the United States and in the West more generally, against totalitarianism, both on the right and on the left. And so governments actually pour enormous amounts of resources, in fact, into cultivating creativity in their citizens. And it spurs and helps to fuel actually collaborations between artists and technologists and engineers in the 60s and 70s. Patrick McRae, you see Santa Barbara's written a wonderful book about this. But it also lays the groundwork, it turns out, for aspects of Silicon Valley, in fact, and the industries that develop in Silicon Valley. So that by the early 21st century at least, we talk about things like the creative industries. And we talk about creatives as types of people. So not just as a creative, not just as an adjective, right, but as a kind of person, a creative. And cities and nations end up staking their economic foundation, in fact, on these things, especially in the post-industrial societies. And so you have this layered on top of this political importance of a creative person or the creative self. You have the economic importance, in fact, of this creative person or creative self as well. We're attracted to cities and given all kinds of inducements, for instance, to come and to help create the creative economies of these cities as well. And so we're in a fascinating moment, I think, because in many ways, it's the same kind of post-war history that helped to create Silicon Valley and the kinds of technological infrastructures that then create ChatGPT that we're now debating about and talking about as potential challenges or potential boons, in fact, to creativity itself. It's, in fact, because of that history that we can talk about something like creativity in the age of ChatGPT.
Yeah, and it makes me think of what you brought up, I think, in your talk, which is, and I invite you all to jump in on this notion of hype. There are many who would argue that this technology, generative AI, is being hyped much like 10 years ago was something else, and 10 years ago was something else. Are we mere participants in a hype cycle being generated and carefully crafted by others? And because in some ways, where our culture's attention goes, our culture's attention doesn't go somewhere else. And so I'm just curious, now, in other words, let's reflect on the magnitude or potential magnitude of this moment. Does this feel different from the public conversation about blockchain, public conversation about Web3, the public conversation about social media? Minli, do you have a reflection on this theme of hype and cultural attention span, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a fascinating word. So adjacent to the word hype, another word that comes to mind is the word gimmick, right? And the word gimmick is usually used like in a dismissive, totalizing sense But recently I've been reading some of the work of cultural theorist Sian Ngai, and she writes this great book called The Theory of the Gimmick. I am possibly going to do a significant disservice to the work by attempting to paraphrase a really, really nuanced and provocative book. But somewhere in the introduction to her book, The Theory of the Gimmick, Sian Ngai talks about a gimmick as a trick, a wonder, and sometimes just a thing. It can be underperforming at times to disappoint you. It can be overperforming, it's trying too hard. It can seem fundamentally gratuitous, unnecessary, and yet can seem strangely useful. And she sees kind of like all of these facets as being almost like a miniature model of capital. What this theory opens up for me as a writer and a technologist is just kind of a realization or an acceptance that whenever we encounter new technologies, our judgment of it, the technologies themselves, at any given time of the day or different day of the week, you might feel excited about it, captivated by it, disturbed, troubled, apathetic, and that we can flicker between all of these states at once simultaneously. So our prerogative then, hype cycle or not, is to, I think, actually attend to these feelings seriously. Why do I feel captivated by this particular incarnation, but absolutely threatened by this other one? What does this tell me about my position or someone else's position in relation to power and precarity? Whether you feel threatened or not by a new technology, I think very much relates to your position in relation to power and precarity.
I love that. I think it is National Arts and Humanities Month. October is, and I think about the awe and wonder you feel when you enter a 16th century cathedral is no different from the awe and wonder we felt when we first interacted. Both are okay. Helena, I was really struck in your presentation. I took a picture of it. This notion of creativity is curiosity and courage. Can you and so if we're thinking about the future of creativity, we're ostensibly thinking about the future of curiosity and courage. What do you think these technologies do to those exclusively almost human sensibilities? I think it's a fascinating way to think about which way the wind is blowing. Not just on creativity, but
I don't think there is like one generic answer to this. It really depends on the human who is interacting with technologies. Like some people dismiss it off the bat. I mean, others are kind of like, Einstein said like, his only kind of like feature is curiosity, that he stays on the project longer than others. And again, I think like me being driven by curiosity kind of like opened me a lot of doors into like the worlds that I didn't know, I didn't belong. I feel like imposters there. But sometimes people dismiss, I'm not like, I don't know, I can't work with technology, or I'm not creative, and kind of like shut the world of possibilities for them. So, yeah, I think, like, again, we will talk about this probably later, but education is a very important thing. I mean, this should be kind of like, I think that's the most important feature in kids to kind of grow this curiosity and the way that they can do whatever. I mean, technology allows them like to learn quickly, to learn like very widely. They just need to have like this desire.
Yeah, it makes me think, creative process has always, part of curiosity is this notion of wonder, and creativity, to me sits adjacent to this notion of wonder. And I wonder, for not intended, and this is for any of you, creative process is almost felt mystical, right? When you come across someone who's written a film script or produced a movie or constructed a piece of art, has this mystical quality. Do technologies like ChatGPT, might they serve to demystify creativity? And what does it mean for creative process to feel so near when perhaps what's been a big driver of curiosity and creativity has been that bridge? Just curious if anyone's got a reflection on the mystical nature of creativity perhaps becoming less mystical.
Creativity is is a muscle, basically. I keep saying this, but you need to train it. I mean, it's like, I'm grateful to my mom, and this is probably like back to Soviet Union way it was like do-it-yourself kind of culture. So if you want something, you better do it. So, I mean, whatever, nice dress, I don't know, like fancy something, like pottery, make it. So, and that's why you kind of like know that you can do it, whatever.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just maybe riffing off of what you said, that creativity is a muscle. There are definitely these like paradoxical, contradictory notions of like creativity is something that's mystical, and then creativity is something that is cultivated, that there's labor involved in that, and behind what appears to be a flash of a great thought is many, like years, decades of work, honing a craft. And in this particular moment, it's interesting because generative AI in some ways invisibilizes that the creative work. It invisibilizes the labor of writing or the labor of making art, and it's not just the labor of researching and sitting down and doing that thing, but the labor of Min-Jin Lee, who's a novelist who wrote the novel Pachinko and among other books. She recently posted something on her social media kind of reflecting on what this moment in generative AI means for writers like her, which is, she's written all these novels within the span of 3 decades. She's left, a financially secure job in order to do this, and also social respectability, left a health insurance. So there's like incredible labor behind the act of creativity. So we're at a really interesting and provocative moment where it seems like this particular technology just effaces or erases all of that. On the other hand, one of the great recent works that I've read by a writer named Farrar, she wrote an essay for The Believer magazine, I think sometime last year. It was anthologized in the Best American Essays of 2022. She wrote an essay in collaboration with ChatGPT, whatever version it was at that point in time, very much in the collaborative nature of your work. And it is one of the most moving essays that I've read. It touches on kind of her experience of encountering, of like remembering and thinking through the death of her sister when she was in college. And the way that she uses ChatGPT to be in conversation with this technology is to give it an excerpt of her writing, and ChatGPT will then extrapolate and build out that piece. And with every iteration that she does this, she gives more to ChatGPT, more longer paragraphs, and you see the way that ChatGPT then responds to having more training data, in a sense. You see it almost become more lyrical. There is an editorial aspect too, I'm sure, to this. I haven't talked about Nivara about this, but I would imagine that the act of writing is also then looking at the output of what something like ChatGPT might give you, and editing and thinking about the pacing, thinking about which beats land and don't land for a reader, and sculpting all of that work together. That's a very long and meandering answer to a question around, creativity is a really tricky thing.
And building on something you said around the editorial nature of some of these platforms, Helena, you work with these platforms, not all. Well, you have exposure to.
No, but I have.
But having worked at companies like Google and Twitter, one of the things you realize is these are human beings in the room making choices around how these products show up, and each small decision around where the cursor is there a cursor, plays an incidental, sometimes very consequential role in creative process. Does that resonate with you as you think about this?
Actually, the other day I was thinking there is this Conway law that the design reflects the organization structure. I think I'm very familiar with Midjourney, and this what triggered my thought that basically the aesthetics and philosophy beyond the generative AI output reflects the founder's team. I mean, I'm not sure. It's definitely with OpenAI as well.
Right.
And I think it's like also with Google products, DALL-E is kind of like too digitally correct for me, but it's definitely kind of like these
products
aesthetics.
They become personifications
Exactly.
of the founders in ways sometimes we don't want to acknowledge. And so then, from where I sit, I think thinking about, well, who's in these rooms where these things happen becomes important. Edward, could you reflect, I mean, you're in higher education, what do you think the roles, responsibilities, duties of higher ed is in this question of creativity, not just staying still, but thriving and flourishing? How do you think about the obligations of higher ed on these questions?
Yeah, it's interesting. So generative AI over the last kind of year and a half, as you alluded to in your remarks as well, has really seized higher education. Initially, it created a little bit of a crisis, especially around questions of plagiarism and originality, et cetera. What would the future of humanities assignments look like? Is it the death of the essay, et cetera, et cetera? But I think one of the interesting things that it has actually sparked after the initial panic is a really interesting understanding and conversation about where creativity actually resides and where originality actually resides. So I'm going to give you the counterexample, and then I'm going to give you what I actually believe. The counterexample is I heard somebody who was involved actually in developing some of these generative AI systems saying, no, but this is wonderful because basically you can basically get the AI to do the entire literature review, summary, research, and then you get the results, and then from the results you basically write your essay. And so it just eliminates a bunch of grunt work that is not very interesting. And so, I'm a historian. Like that grunt work is that's the most interesting part. And also, that's where a lot of creativity resides, I mean, for us, it's about, you go into an archive and you find a thread, and then you start speculating about where it might lead you or what other sources you might be. That's really the part where, creativity isn't just in, assimilating the end product.
Right.
It's in the entire process. And so I think it has really created this kind of moment where educators are thinking very carefully about how it is that they can use, in fact, these tools to illustrate precisely these kinds of points. But also, I have a graduate student who's teaching a course and who is giving her students an assignment to actually compare human-written essays basically with AI-written essays and grade them according to the rubric. And so thinking about what rubrics actually distinguish these two essays is also a fascinating move, right? And trying to understand how it is, what it is that we're going to value basically in the making of assignments themselves.
No, I mean, I think, as evidenced by the program I've launched, I think this is a major window of opportunity to take creativity to market in new ways, and to Minli, your earlier point, to ensure people realize that creativity isn't just about the eureka moment. It's about a deep human habit that is always on. One last kind of big picture question, I'll start with you, Edward, before we open it up to, in a couple minutes we'll go to the audience, is about public institutions and governments and their role here. I'm really, you referenced, Edward, to the Cold War and creativity as having political currency beginning in the 1950s. I'm also struck by the fact that it was during the Cold War in the 1960s where we also invested in the humanities. The National Endowment for Humanities, the State Humanities Council were all born during the Cold War in an era in which the Kennedy and Johnson administration said, wait a minute, STEM, let's ensure we've invested in humanities pillars, which is why we're all here today, actually. And so, is this another moment, actually, for public institutions to step up and declare a major around something? Or should they just be in regulatory orbit? My concern is that they're talking about regulation, but maybe missing a blue sky conversation about something else. Just reflect on what you would say to policymakers, public officials at all levels as they talk about these things in real time.
I'm happy to start. So I think that the regulation is very important to talk about, but you're absolutely right that it's not enough. So, but just speaking briefly about the importance of something like that, Alondra Nelson at the Institute here in Princeton was foundational in helping to create this AI Bill of Rights. Essentially, it's not binding, but it's a set of best practices basically and suggestions for the development of generative AI among other forms. And I think that is incredibly important just because there is the capacity for these things also to be misused in ways that it's very difficult to come back from. It's very easy to cross a Rubicon, after which you can't really come back. So that's a very important part. But I agree with you completely that it's not enough. And in fact, I think that the role of public institutions is enormous, and the role of the humanities actually, I think, is gargantuan in a case like this. I mean, I'm biased in the sense that my institute and my field is precisely dedicated, the history of science and technology, but science and technology studies more generally, is dedicated precisely to using the advanced methodologies of the humanities to understand science and technology. And one of the things that we realized very quickly is that the humanities actually are uniquely positioned, in fact, to ask some of the questions that can't be answered, in fact, by engineering, for instance, or computer science. They are questions about, what is creativity, what is the role of the artist, but all these are questions that humanists are actually incredibly well poised to answer. Questions about the public good, et cetera, all the things that you gesture to. And so I think it is a moment basically where it really requires a kind of bold action, maybe on the level of what happened, as you say, in the 60s under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, to say that this is a moment where the humanities actually has an immensely important role to play.
Maybe the National Endowment for Creativity. Any reflections from you all on public institutions and public officials? You're going to abstain? Okay.
I think Edward has pretty much encapsulated, the significance and the primacy of this sort of interdisciplinary dialogue, and especially even in the area of regulation. It shouldn't just be CEOs of tech companies there, that we should be inviting the humanities and the social sciences into the discussion as well.
That's interesting, right? You see these White House photo ops, and there's no one representing human institutions, actually. Interesting. All right, we're going to go to questions from the audience, if that works, and we've got 20 minutes. We'll start in the back, right there. Please.
Very quick. First of all, thank you. This is marvelous. The opening, the way you set everything up, I think is perfect, particularly for the way that it ended. Because it makes me go back to the original statement that you made about sort of the potential of AI, right, to sort of express our wonder, but also raise questions, troubling questions about our humanity. So I was hoping that you could, the panelists could talk just a little bit more about how this might be an assault on our humanity, right? Particularly given the way that whatever's produced by generative AI, right, is operating in a world of human perception, in the way that world of human perception is being altered. I was just hoping that you could sort of use, the idea of the gimmick, the magnitude of the technology itself and the way in which it's obscured from the person who's actually witnessing it, right? They don't see the machine behind it. I was wondering if you could talk about those concepts related to the opening statement about the assault on what makes us human. Hopefully that wasn't too weak.
It's a really big question. That's I think we need some philosophers in the room, cognitive scientists, biologists, etc. I'll have to think about that one, but if anyone wants to jump in the meantime.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and to give a very kind of sketchy and broad answer, but to frame it in this way, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that a lot of the concern around generative AI is because people see it or they fear it as being an assault also on a certain model of human relations, basically, that they think is actually under attack. So let me give you one example of that model of human relations. So when authors, for instance, recently who have had their books scraped basically by these generative AI systems learned that their works were actually part of these systems, they have protested about it very, very, very strongly. And you think to yourself, okay, well, what is going on there exactly? Because often when they talk about what concerns them, they say things like, well, I didn't give my permission for these works to be used in this way. But then you think, okay, but like how, technically speaking, how is that different from your work going out in the world? Me, for instance, reading a whole bunch of books, right? And then assimilating them, thinking about them, and then rendering them in a form that's slightly different. And what you realize very quickly is that really what's different about that is that I am held accountable to a certain kind of moral economy around the production of a work that an AI system isn't, right? That in this sense, that when you did an enormous amount of work to write your book, and I have read it, and Rishi and everybody else ends up writing these books, and I have done an enormous amount of work to assimilate it, to think about it, then your work is being valued. The immense amount of work that you put into writing the book is being valued by me. Similarly, by extending that work, by mirroring it, by also putting in an enormous amount of human labor. And in the sense of these generative systems, you don't have that. You don't have the recognition or the perpetuation of a kind of bond, a kind of commitment or a kind of social contract between the people who are producing the works in the first instance and then the generation basically of these second order systems. And so that, I think, is really what's at the core of a lot of those concerns. It's an assault on an ideal about how we ought to value human labor. And in fact, by sitting with it and struggling with it and extending it and extending the kind of values that went into producing it in the first place. And so that is what I think is actually troubling in that case. So I don't know if this answers your question. I'm sorry. I don't know if it answered your question, but it's my thought.
Thank you.
I think that's a really great response.
Let's go right there. Yeah, Cliff.
I just wanted to ask, again, very interesting topic panel. So we keep throwing around the word humanities and human and all that, and then we talk about all these wonderful developments of social media and technology and AI and automatic driving cars. But has it actually made us more human or made the world more habitable? Or it doesn't have seemed to have helped humanity at all. In other words, if you read the newspaper, you follow world news, nothing has seemed to have changed much in that regard. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I can start, because I sort of resurfaced this notion of hype cycles, and I think that's what I was getting at, right? You have, in the 90s, conversations about the new economy and bridges to new centuries, to the utopia of the early internet and social media, which I was a protagonist of, to everything that happened in the late 2010s around Web3 and blockchain and payments, and when really a lot of the innovation was really around ordering sandwiches and cooking cars. And then in the 2020s, it's this. And yet alongside that, our society's becoming more unequal. You got the middle class hollowing out. And so therein lies the reason to surface this sort of self-aware question about what are we talking about here? And ways to course correct this ecosystem so that a North Star of people's in room where these things happen isn't merely usage and subscriptions and it's affinity, not addiction, things like that. But don't have an answer, but I think you're getting at, and one reason I'm hopeful is that these technologies are being shipped in 2023, not 2003. I think we have all become more mature as a society and willing to be critical and balanced. Maybe the Princeton Public Library was hosting events like this in 2003 and 2013, taking a critical look at the technology of the day. But I'm delighted that our culture's willing to be thoughtful at the front end. Let's take another one right here, just to speed through. Sorry.
Thank you. There seems to be a lot of concern about AI, a lot of fear in my family. And I would like to propose that the humanities, all of us, regular citizens, people in education, in the social and human arts, make a statement saying we live in a world that is full of challenges, tremendous challenges. You look at climate change, you look at the social scene, the racial and inequality that still pervades our society. So why don't we use human creativity, aided by ChatGPT and the myriad other tools that have been or that are being generated and discovered. I think we need to take a stand. We became interested in creativity when the Soviet Union got ahead of us in that race. Remember?
Right.
Because schools were not creating creative people. They were creating people that could pass the SAT or the GRE or whatever, but that was not the same as creativity. So creativity is basically human, and it has to do about improving our conditions as human beings, our own condition, and our fellow beings. So I think there's a tremendous room for the humanities that are represented here.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I know there have been sort of, Edward, you were referencing protests and the like. I'm not aware of sort of a, to use your word, major stand that a large-scale institution or national organization has taken on these issues. It's a great idea. Let's take a question up here. Let's work our way to the front.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful topic and a wonderful panel. I learned so much and got inspired. Actually, I think I have something, I think it resonant with Professor Jones, right? What he said about creativity. What from my understanding, Professor Jones said, well, you know, while he's writing books, the process of writing books is a kind of a creativity put into action. So I resonate with that because I believe that creativity is the innate human needs. It's in the history when human was born. Your synthesis said, well, creativity itself is under siege. I think it's a very interesting statement. It's, you know, in the historical junctures of many times, it's under siege, but they always prevail because it's the innate. We are human. We have the needs, just as we need to express our our love, our intelligence, our help, passion toward each other. So it's part of us. It's so in that aspect, I'm very optimistic. It's just like somebody, okay, the machine can do the hugs and kisses for you, but you still want to do the hugs and kisses yourself. So that's my feeling about that. But meanwhile, I do have a little bit, I was like the gentleman, I was resonant with that gentleman because when it just came out, like early this year, I was freaked out because of the perspective. Well, what if this thing morphed into a monster that out of control, right? Just like some scenario that depicted in the 2001 A Space Odyssey. The creativity of the machine out-created our human being. So that's why I'm sort of like pay attention to the regulation part of it, to how to manage the risk of it. And in that aspect, I don't know how optimistic you are on that aspect. Do you think it's something that can be the tool of humans instead eventually our human become its victims? Thank you.
Optimism?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think often about sort of what an event like this might look like in 2033. Right? What might we reflect on in the last 10 years? And one of the things is just not wanting to see a new creative divide, right? Creativity is intrinsic to all of us, not wanting to see a class of have and have-nots who harnessed, some folks that have invested in the new human superpower and others that haven't had access to it. So let's think about that event. All right, we're going to take a few more questions. Let's take a couple more questions, and then I'm going to do a question roundup if that works. Let's do a question from over here, if that's okay. Right here, yeah.
First of all, the four of you are brilliant, and I ask you, throughout history, it's always been the wise people in a culture really knew what was going on and could sort of predict where it was going. So I asked the four of you just to file in the back of your head that you have to think about people and what it's going to do to people. And it seems good on the surface, but it's very important to understand how this is going to affect your neighbors, your family, your friends, and everyone in your community. And that's all.
Amen to that. Karin, did you have a question?
Sorry, I hope you don't mind me throwing one in too. Along those lines, do you see power for this technology to disrupt what we think of as hierarchies or power relations? Does it in fact give people who otherwise don't have voice an opportunity or a voice or a standing, like flipping us to the hopeful aspects a little bit?
I mean, I'll start with provocation and turn it over to you. And I think one way to think about this question is to think about the planet as a whole. And think, we have obviously a very Western perspective on these things, but I think about young people in, what we tend to call rest of world or frontier markets who just connected to, smartphones and the like in the last 5 to 7 years, awakening to technology that might harness, we might be playing their songs and watching their movies and in 10 years at this event. And so there is reason to believe that there's an opportunity to level the creative playing field to some extent. But
yeah, just two thoughts. I think that historically speaking, things like that have always happened, which is what I find so fascinating. That technologies are built and engineered in a certain way, but who of us hasn't bent a paperclip towards some untoward purpose, right? Like, it's designed in a certain way, it's meant to be used a certain way, but you might use it to open up the SIM card on your phone or whatever it is, right? These aren't intended purposes, and that's a very mundane example. But I think that all of these technologies end up functioning to some extent in that way as well. And as they become more accessible is maybe the wrong word, but as they become more widespread, often they get hacked, frankly, in interesting ways. But the last point that I just wanted to make is just picking up on a few of the comments that have come before is, and maybe going back especially to the gentleman's comments, is that when we think about what the future holds, I would just really hate it though if we thought that we can't shape that future, because it's a little bit the way that the comments can go in that direction if we're not careful, right? When we look forward 10 years, what does it look like? Well, that's up to us in some sense, right? And so I would really love for us to leave this room also thinking about the futures that we want to create, for instance, with these technologies, how we want them to end up occupying our lives and societies, how we want them to end up breaking down barriers, and to work basically to end up realizing or making real those kinds of possibilities as well.
Well, if there are more questions, let's just hear them all, and then we'll all. So here's one here. There's a bunch. So if you could just ask the question, we've got 4. It sounds like. Go ahead.
Yeah. In the last 10 or 20 years, in Princeton in particular, every committee or public functioneer has been using abbreviations when they named a new something. I'm concerned that the English language is going to change completely in 20 or 40 years from now. Looking at what you guys have here, the word artificial intelligence is almost never used again. Any newspaper you open up, it's only AI, AI, AI. There is no artificial intelligence. You have a ChatGPT. I have no idea what GPT. On the board, you had another one, I think it was GNP or GAP, in capital letters, which tells me it's an abbreviation of what? So we are changing the language. And I don't know, it's my feeling that in 20 years from now, 60 to 80 people in this country will not understand what's going on because they haven't got the background and the college education or whatever. Even the colleges are not going to teach anything. So what are you think, especially about when you look into the past to predict the future? What do you think is going to happen to the language?
Well, I'll just say this, that historians are terrible predictors of the future. Let's collect the other comments maybe first, but thank you very
Let's
much.
just grab the final 3 questions, and then we'll do final thoughts, and then there's a reception.
I'm actually going to ask a question. And if this is inappropriate or the wrong question, maybe change it to what it should have been. But I couldn't watch Stephen Colbert for the last couple of, last month or two, because the writers were on strike. And one of the things that I've heard that they're on strike for was they're concerned about AI, artificial intelligence. Can you explain what it is that they were concerned about, and is there really I know the strike is settled, but is there really a solution, or what is it that we should be concerned about in terms of, I'll call it the misuse of AI? I know there's a lot of good things that you guys are focusing on, and creativity, and I think that's terrific. But what are the problems with regard to that? Or if you wanted to, okay, I'll stop.
Thank you. Have the final 2 in the back.
Yeah, I was just wondering, technology often drags us down our own little rabbit holes. People get alienated because everyone's in their own screen world. Do you see opportunities?
Like an ice cream.
Do you see?
Like this. Like this.
Try mine. Okay, not mine.
So my question is whether you see collaboration opportunities because of AI, whether there are places where people are starting to work together more because they're using AI together.
Was this the final question here?
Yeah, final question right there, and then we'll do final thoughts from each panelist.
Yes, thank you. So there are concerns obviously about AI models scraping content which they don't have the rights to, copyright and intellectual property. But a larger concern for me, and this wasn't really touched upon too much, is the circular nature of artificial intelligence versus human creativity. Models rely on human creativity for their inputs, right? But then we as humans turn to these AI models to generate results, be they images or text in ChatGPT's case. So this becomes a problem, almost like a snake eating its tail after a while, from what I understand. In fact, researchers have a name for this. If AI models are trained on other AI content rather than on original human creativity, it's called model collapse. So my question is about the sustainability of the AI revolution, in the sense that if we become too dependent upon the machines to generate our content, whatever it may be, then what is the incentive for humans to generate new original content, because we're now relying on the machines to do it for us? And then what do they train machines in the future on if they don't have original human creativity generated content? So, and this, you can see this online. Publishers like Stack Overflow, which is a major leading tech content site, has seen traffic decline since ChatGPT came out last fall because it was trained on its data. So my question is, where does this go?
All right, thank you all for your questions. We'll do final thoughts from each panelist, and then we'll call it an evening.
I will start.
Sure.
Responding to your question. First of all, in general, artificial intelligence models, they can learn. They actually created from this perspective. They made predictor. They sort of creative. And then to your point that it kind of stopping people from incentive to be creative. Some people are not doing this stuff because they are lazy or whatever. So they will watch TV. So how much is this creative activity? So people who are creative, like this lady said, that they will continue doing stuff. Maybe like this point of the stuff I'm doing, like for people, for small community, for my friends. And I think we'll see more of this, and I hope we won't rely on like Google and stuff creating content for us. But like gentleman suggested there, we will do like collective like art creation. I know systems like do this, autonomous agents that create art, like people participate, they give their prompt. So I think there is an optimistic and positive side of this.
I think maybe I'll riff on that a little bit, Helena, and the question that you posed. I think there's a school of thought out there that most of what generative AI produces right now, they're mathematically average, right? Insofar as you have this large training set, and it's modeled based on what, statistically, what's the word that's most likely to come after a word that you produced, right? So it's mathematically average. So there's perhaps, this dovetails with the question about the writer's strikes to some extent too, but there's then room for human beings, or human writers and human creators to be exceptional. So if you want mathematically average content, which is pretty good, right? You want average marketing copy, average set of images that actually do a decent job. If you want a work of art, if you want to read a novel that moves you, a TV show that changes the way that you think, I think that's where human creativity can still play a role, and AI can be perhaps a way to augment that, depending on your writing style, depending on the possibilities that you're trying to explore. The last thing maybe that I'll mention, just coming back to the role of literature a little bit, is I think about speculative fiction writers. Great speculative fiction writers try to kind of situate in the future where we're going, right? All the different possibilities, the various trajectories. So a speculative fiction writer might look at generative AI today and say, okay, well, there will be a proliferation of false content, so society is going to go back to everything happening in person and all paperwork being on paper. Or they could say, it'll be an arms race, and now we have to verify everyone's identity through embedded cryptographic chips. Or they could say that the structure of society would change completely because only in a competition-based capitalistic system, when someone wins at someone else's expense, this is where you find generative AI falsification. The reason why you might find the implications of these models taking over isn't that particular economic system. Perhaps you would move towards a cooperative market system rather than a capitalistic competitive world. But that being said, so if you're a speculative fiction writer and you're trying to map out all of these trajectories, what is most interesting for me is not in necessarily the predictive power of these stories, but for us to be able to work backwards from that and think about what we'd like to ask for from technology, from technologists, from humanists today, in order to get to the kind of trajectory of future that we want.
Yeah, you've all been very patient, so I'm going to be quite brief. Yeah, on the point about collaboration, I absolutely think that there are immense possibilities for collaboration between artists and humanists and social scientists and computer engineers, et cetera. And I think that I'm seated next to two people who embody, in fact, in their own person, collaborations in that way, which I find really fascinating. To the point basically about this model collapse, I think that that's something to be genuinely feared if the model encompasses kind of the totality of human relations. So, if everybody ends up turning to ChatGPT in order to create this content, then you're absolutely right. But the past certainly seems to suggest that technologies don't function that way, and I'm very, very hopeful that the future will suggest the same thing. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add that it may just be a routine fact, or maybe there's irony or inspiration in the fact that the industry seemingly most disrupted by this technology to date is technology itself, to your point. And so whether that's a routine fact or something to derive hope and inspiration from, or we'll leave that for another event. But thank you all for attending. Thank you for the council and